For over 4 decades, one family lived in a part of the Siberian taiga so remote that it effectively didn't exist on any map. They survived in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, completely separated from the rest of the human race. In 1936, life in Soviet Russia was defined by a pervasive atmosphere of suspicion. Neighbors disappeared without explanation, and for Karp Lykov, the threat was moving closer. To protect his wife and children, he decided to walk away from everything they knew, disappearing into the wilderness overnight. They pushed hundreds of miles into the interior, moving past the points where animal tracks usually end. Eventually, the forest canopy became so dense that the sun rarely reached the ground, and the very idea of a path vanished into the undergrowth. Karp finally halted his family in a deep, sunless valley. When his young daughter asked if anyone else ever visited this place, Karp's response was a quiet warning: "Not anymore." By crossing that final ridge, the Lykovs had moved beyond the reach of help or discovery. They were now operating under a different set of rules, where survival depended entirely on what they could scrape from the frozen earth. Any thought of retreat was quickly erased by the weather. The Siberian winter arrived with horizontal winds and temperatures that froze moisture instantly, locking the valley under several feet of snow for months at a time. They constructed a small log cabin, but the structure was constantly under siege. On the coldest nights, they'd wake to find the door frozen shut from the outside, requiring them to wait for the ice to crack before they could leave. Every day was a search for calories. Karp would spend hours on his knees, using handmade wooden tools to dig through the frost for roots or small patches of rye he'd managed to plant, often returning to the cabin with nothing. Over time, the lack of medicine and a diet of little more than roots and water took its toll. 2 of the children, Korea and Dmitry, grew progressively weaker until their bodies finally gave out. Karp had to dig their graves in the frozen ground by hand. There were no outsiders to witness the loss, and no way to signal for help. The forest simply remained silent. The taiga was a methodical force. It took their health, their resources, and their family members, leaving the survivors in a state of total isolation. By the time 10 years had passed, the Lykovs had forgotten the sound of a voice that wasn't their own. They hadn't seen a single footprint or any sign of human activity in a decade. But then, the family noticed something they couldn't explain. Just outside their door, deep depressions would appear in the dirt. These weren't the marks of boots or any animal the Lykovs recognized, but they were fresh and they were heavy. Behind the cabin, they found areas where the snow had been deliberately disturbed. It looked as though something had stood in that spot for a long period of time before turning and heading back into the trees. Karp told his children the ground was simply shifting as it thawed and refroze, but he could see the marks were new, appearing during the night when the family was inside. Logically, they were the only humans for hundreds of miles, yet the environment was providing physical evidence that something was moving through their camp while they slept. The silence lasted for 42 years. It was finally broken in 1978 by a sound the family didn't recognize, the sharp, rhythmic clink of metal hitting rock. Then came a noise that paralyzed the survivors, a clear, deliberate knock on their wooden door. When Karp opened the door, he was met by a team of geologists in modern gear. The scientists were stunned. They had expected an empty valley, not a family that seemed to have stepped out of the 1930s. The team looked through the property and found no evidence of electricity, no modern tools, and no medicine. The Lykovs were using techniques for weaving and farming that had been obsolete for generations. Based on their inventory, the family was living on a diet that should not have been enough to sustain manual labor in sub-zero temperatures. Yet, despite 4 decades without any outside support, they were still there. After finding the family, the geologists tried to retrace the route the Lykovs would have taken in 1936. Even with modern topographical maps and heavy survival equipment, the researchers found the terrain nearly impossible to navigate. Mapping the distance from the nearest 1936 settlement, researchers found a problem. Reaching the valley meant crossing multiple mountain ridges and deep ravines. Data shows a massive gap between supply carried and energy needed. A 1930s family would have starved days before reaching it. Shortly after their discovery, Karp's health began to decline. Before he passed away, he told the scientists that the forest had raised them, and now it was finally letting them go. But the final mystery came from Karp's daughter, Agafya. When told she was finally safe from her isolation, she corrected the researchers. She told them they were never truly alone, that an unknown presence had been watching them from the trees for as long as she remembered. We are left with two questions: how a family without equipment managed to cross a terrain that still stops modern explorers, and what it was that Agafya felt was lingering just beyond the edge of their camp.